All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our workshop on innovations in the science and policy of water quality measurement. Thank you so much for being here and participating in these discussions. Water quality issues such as saltwater intrusion, PFAS, non-point source pollution, these all present persistent problems here in California and around the world. And they're putting pressure on already stressed natural ecosystems and human drinking water sources. The goal of this workshop is really to bring a group of people together from diverse backgrounds, natural scientists, engineers, social scientists, resource managers, policymakers, and more, to get a conversation started on where tighter cooperation between these different groups can lead to better management outcomes. We're really excited because we hope to form partnerships between different disciplines in academia and between academia and the public and private sectors that can lead to innovative solutions that not only work in the lab, but also in the field and at scale. We realize that these types of partnerships are not going to form overnight, but we're hoping that this workshop can serve as a catalyst to making connections with people that you might not otherwise run into in your day-to-day. Okay? We're really excited about the program that we've put together. We're going to kick things off this morning with some insight from resource managers, policymakers, and other decision makers to get their perspective on what types of information we need to make better decisions. Then we're going to drill into 3 specific topic areas: saltwater intrusion, non-point source pollution, and managed aquifer recharge. And the goal here is really to ground our discussion about where scientists and policymakers can work together. We're also really looking forward to Bruce's keynote speech this afternoon after lunch. And then tomorrow we'll have the opportunity to dive more deeply into the discussions in a roundtable type format so we can explore the ideas that we worked on today and expand upon them. So before we get started, I just wanted to make a couple of quick announcements so that the day can run as smoothly as possible. Hopefully you all have been able to log into the Wi-Fi. If not, you can follow the instructions on the screen with the change that Caltech Secure should actually be Caltech Visitor, and then you can use that network name and password. We are in California, so there's always the risk of an earthquake. If you do feel shaking, the best thing to do is to get to the ground, find cover, and protect your head and neck with your arms. The bathrooms. If you proceed directly up the stairs to the mezzanine where there was breakfast, and then down 1 flight, you'll find the restrooms. If you need an accessible restroom, you can go out that door, down the elevator, and there's one on the first floor of Baxter Hall. Finally, a quick reminder that we are being recorded today, so please keep that in mind. And then lastly, I just wanted to touch on Caltech's conduct code. This is a code that's really meant to create a productive and safe meeting environment, so we're asking for all of your help in having an open dialogue that respects the opinions of all of our colleagues. So I want to thank the Caltech Center on Science, Society, and Public Policy, the Resnick Institute, the Linde Center, and the Linde Institute for making this possible. And with that, I'll turn it over to Mike, who's going to moderate our first panel.
Thank you. Thank you, Hannah. So I am Mike Alvarez, the co-director of the relatively new Center for Science, Society, and Public Policy at Caltech. My co-director, Frederick Eberhard, is in the back of the room as well here today. So if you want to hear more about what we're up to, you can grab Frederick or I at any point today. So the panel today, we have about an hour. We have 3 speakers who are really going to kind of get us started. When I communicated with the 3 members of this panel this morning, I posed them a series of questions. So it's going to be interesting to hear how we get this conversation started this morning. The questions that I asked for us to think about and how we can kind of frame the next day and a half here at Caltech are: what are the most pressing needs from policymakers and regulators when it comes to water quality measurement, science, and policy? What are the particular pain points that they see that exist for the policy and regulatory community? Are there specific measurement or technological tools that you'd like to see scientists and technologists develop, given that we have scientists and technologists in the audience? And I think, as Hannah alluded to already, how do we improve the collaboration and dialogue between policymakers, regulators, and academic researchers in this area? So I'm really excited to be able to organize this panel this morning. And again, each of the panelists will talk for maybe 10, 15 minutes, and then we'll have time for dialogue and questions and answers. The three who are, you all have the program, the three who are on the panel are Joaquin Esquivel, who's from the California State Water Resources Board Control. He's the chair of the board. Fickas from ESRI, who's the director of Imagery and Remote Sensing Solutions. And Paul Rochelle from the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, the manager of the water quality section. So we'll start with Joaquin.
Thank you, and good morning, and apologies for being a few minutes late this morning. I feel like I need to work in getting ready time these days because it's an incredibly busy time in California water. So my name is Joaquin Esquivel. I have the pleasure of being the chair of the State Water Resources Control Board. Quick gloss on the board. We're a 5-member board. We were created about 50 years ago, bringing together pollution control boards that were created in the 1940s here in California and a water rights office that was established in 1914. And it was with the thought and acknowledgement that needing to protect water quantity and quality at the same time in the same institution was going to be really critical. At that time, California had about 15 million Californians, and quickly it was really acknowledged that water quality, because of the national discussion that was also happening certainly, was going to be a real limiting factor to the growth, the health, the well-being of our communities. And so proud, to be part of a 50-year institution that has tried to do its best to tackle what are a lot of challenging issues we know out there. The Water Board was actually created about 4 years before the Clean Water Act. So nationally, it had a lot of impact and ultimately influenced the way the Clean Water Act was developed and the way we look at the protection of water quality in our basins. I need to take a deep breath real quick. I ran down here because I was late. So on me. When in addition to the water quality authorities that we have, which we work with our 9 regional water quality control boards to regulate water quality, they are all based off of watersheds within the state. They are actually the main permitting entity. They deal with all the regulated entities. They permit much of the activities that go on both through Porter Cologne, the state law, and the Clean Water Act. And then the state board oversees at a state level those programs. So those programs include things like the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program. There, when you look at discussion around non-point source and particularly around nutrients, which in a warming climate, we know that harmful algal blooms will continue to be a challenging issue. The nutrient inputs we're putting into the system then have huge impacts on, nearshore hypoxia, ultimately needing to get a handle on those. And fortunate that we have some running room with agriculture. It is a huge issue nationally as well. And fortunate to start to begin to understand how we best regulate that industry. In addition to the water quality work, the Water Board administers water rights. That's been a pretty light touch within the state of California. I look to other Western colleagues like Colorado or Utah, and they have far more of a sophisticated and developed water rights system where it's been a bit light touch within the state. But data, and particularly say remote sensing with OpenET or other tools, is going to become a critical part, already is a critical part, and I can touch on that a bit here and there, on what the state board is going to need to do if we're going to really be able to live up to the promise of our institution, which is not just looking at quality, but also quantity at that same time, and really understanding the dynamics that our complex watersheds experience through all of our activities, through the development we've had. But importantly, I continue to feel, especially on the water rights side, that we're reconciling, by and large, these systems that we've inherited. There are a lot of legacy challenges that are impacting our watersheds. Those have to do with quality. It has to do with the way we manage watersheds writ large, perhaps the way we've disconnected floodplains, et cetera. But with the added pressure now of not just resolving all those legacy issues, but really reconciling our system for the climate we now have with climate change, our deeper droughts, our flashier floods. The reality is that you look at most of the development of our watersheds in the state, and they occurred in a relatively wet period, and also without sometimes as great an understanding as to the activities that we're undertaking like disconnecting floodplains and changing the way water moved across the landscape. So, these tools, ultimately, when we talk about remote sensing, machine learning, we won't necessarily touch on AI because it's there, but I keep feeling, especially in the water sector, we're not as developed as the energy sector, even transportation or others, when it comes to really having data better be the basis for the sophisticated decision-making that we're in. There's a lot of data. There's a lot of sophisticated decision-making. That's not to say that there isn't. But I know we here in the state, we passed what's known as AB 1755, or Open Water Data Act. That was all meant to, really try to better foment the basis for that decision-making. It's really at the information, the monitoring data, the geospatial data we have, better synthesizing that into tools that can translate into, the regulatory side, can translate into some of these very, wicked and thorny issues that we continue to deal with. Again, both because of legacy impacts and because of the added pressure of climate change. So just to touch on maybe a couple of examples, and I'll kind of wrap and look forward to actually more back and forth and engagement, is really the use of OpenET here at the State Water Resources Control Board. So we have an active, what's known as an alternative compliance plan in the Delta for measurement, where it's sometimes difficult within the legal Delta, the San Francisco Bay Delta that is here, to measure water diversions. There's siphon pumps, variable rates that end up happening because of where tidal influences are. And so what happened was a number of local growers, and also with leadership at the State Water Board from the Office of the Delta Water Master, thought, well, is there a cheaper, lower cost way of being able to comply what's known as, I think it's SB 88. It's a state law that requires direct and measurement of all diversions within the state above a certain acre foot, and I'd be just guessing if I try to remember what it was. But it actually was passed in 2018, and it was the first time in California's history in the administration of water rights that we actually had a requirement for a yearly accounting of diversions from water right holders. And so, sometimes when I say it's has been a light touch in the state, it's one of my greatest examples. It's a little hard to administer a water rights system that, in some cases, diverters were only reporting once every, 4 or 5 years or so. And so, nonetheless, again, there's oftentimes real concerns around the cost of implementing and putting in meters. And so what was developed was this alternative compliance plan that uses OpenET, uses the evapotranspiration, and that can be seen from an ensemble of models to be able to say, how much did you irrigate on that parcel? What's important is your ET numbers aren't direct diversion data. Meter data is, your better gold standard. But when we're talking about not having any data, or being able to bring folks in with a low-cost tool that brings better confidence in the administration then of rights within a space, it was a worthwhile project. And there's great success. We're in the middle of it now. There's still, I think, a lot of debate. Is your ET enough of a trusted variable that it can replace meter data? We're here to find out. And I think that that's the sort of intersection of policy and some of the tools that are being developed that I'm excited that at the State Water Board, we're open to. We have a huge mission, not just on the water rights and water quality side, but the State Water Board in 2014 had the Division of Drinking Water transferred over from the Department of Public Health. So, when the Water Board and ourselves, members and our staff are trying to think of how best we continue to protect the resources within the state, how best we live up to what is not an easy mission. I know that it's in this space of innovating, using remote sensing, 21st century tools, better focusing on our data and how it supports our decision making, that I think we have a lot of space to explore and efficiencies to be gained. The other quick examples, and I said I'd wrap, but I will quickly here, so I'm staying on time, given my time that I took earlier. Canavision is another tool that we developed. That's using satellite imagery to use machine learning to find out on what is up in these northern parts of the state, real challenge in trying to legalize the cannabis industry and identify who's out there potentially with grows, whether they're greenhouses or diverting from streams and rivers, and finding and bringing them into the program. And so what was actually developed in-house, and this is, all this work, it is so new that what's happening is we have folks that are so motivated and bright coming out of the universities, coming into the State Water Board, and they're used to starting to use tools like machine learning, and on their own home rigs. And that's what happened. We had a staffer that said, we're really behind on being able to even assess. We had staff manually looking at Google Maps and trying to figure out, is that a grow, is that not? And just started to do. And we were able to bring that in-house, resource it a bit, and what we had was a tool that was being used in our cannabis program to be able to just identify places where there's potential grows or other activities, and yes, use human follow-up and intuition thereafter as well, but really start to give ourselves a fighting chance given the scale and scope and geography of the state and the need to advance that program. Those tools, that base ability is also now being used for things like the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act as we start to think, all right, how do we also understand what's happening on the landscape, where there might be wells that we can see, that can be identified, their features, and maybe warrant some follow-up. I think importantly, whenever we use these tools and wherever we're talking about this, it is needed to have great public discourse around, because there is, especially in these days, real distrust of government. And the idea that, we're using satellites and we're looking at what you're doing and somehow, not in creating, distrust, I think, that's an important component of all this. But these are exciting tools and they're necessary, and people in government should want that. People out in the public and society should want government to be using these, because they make efficient what are limited resources and tax dollars, and oftentimes have great benefit and impact. And here we know illegal cannabis grows, and the challenge of the illegal industry is something that is a scourge for many counties. And so the data, the process, the information, the ability for us to do better, that's all a basis for engaging just the public, our regulated entities, and other government leaders across it. So those are a quick few examples. Hopefully just gave you a taste of what we do as well, and I really look forward to what is going to be a robust discussion here further. So thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm, of course, a lifelong recovering academic, so I think I'm the only one with slides here, but I can't stay away from a PowerPoint. I'm Kate Fickas. I'm the ESRI Director, Imagery, Remote Sensing Solutions. I've been in this position for about 6 months. Before that, I've spent really the past 15 years of my career in the water quality, water resources world, trying to connect research from satellite data to the Clean Water Act, policy implementations from wetlands to harmful algal blooms to saltwater intrusion in salt marsh wetlands on the East Coast. I chose this position. I stepped out of academia because I kept seeing a really similar trend over and over again towards really brilliant science being done, especially in the federal government. My last postdoc was with USGS and NASA. Several federal agencies doing the same work, sort of to no end. It wasn't getting into the hands of decision makers and being implemented in policy. So I wanted to see if I could switch jobs and act as sort of a bridge or a translator using what at ESRI we call the geographic approach. So using this geospatial information to help tell stories and make it easier to translate science into policy and decision making. Concurrently with my first postdoc with the EPA and UMass Amherst, I worked as the harmful algal bloom program manager at Utah Department of Environmental Quality. I was put on the spot quite frequently. Utah has a very large amount of recreational water bodies and a very large amount of cyanobacteria, or harmful algal blooms. And it was here that I really got my hands dirty in both the literal and metaphorical sense with how policy and decision-making interacts with science and what you can and can't do or get done towards your goals. Mine were protecting public health for drinking water and recreational activities, and then an aquatic life with these harmful algal blooms. Part of the reason is that one of the disconnects that we have is bringing science into very formal policy. It often takes a really long time before the science that we're going to hear about today and tomorrow is actually implemented in policy. So what that meant for me in Utah as the HAB program coordinator was that I couldn't necessarily use a lot of the cutting edge science that Joaquin was talking about in order to inform decision-making, for example, closing a water body, treating a water body, or keeping the public safe. My research background is in remote sensing, pretty hardcore algorithmic development, so I started a research project trying to see if I could track point source and non-point source pollution coming into one of our biggest and most infamous lakes, Utah Lake. And I got pretty far. I started to identify hotspots, and because it wasn't codified in the EPA's latest recommendations for human health criteria, we couldn't necessarily implement that at a wide scale across the state. That meant the state chose, in somewhat direct contrast to what we were recommending at DEQ, to treat the lake with large amounts of copper chemicals instead of potentially identifying the source and non-point sources of these pollutants that act as catalysts for harmful algal blooms. So about $10 million spent on dumping copper into a very, very large lake that spans almost 20 miles top to bottom, instead of saying, hey, we know where these hotspots are. And this is kind of when I started to step out of that role. Another professor within Utah spoke up publicly against the chemicals being dumped into the lake, and he was sued for about $5 million by a fairly litigious copper chemical company. So again, it's really important. Even just a single sentence in policy can make or break whether or not we can use cutting-edge technology within our decision-making frameworks from the local level to the federal level. One of the biggest examples, again, with my HAB work was that when we're talking about HABs, trying to convey the magnitude or the extent or the danger to the public, we're talking about how big is the bloom, how often is it occurring, and then how frequently is it occurring. But none of those are taken into account by the EPA and their recommended criteria. So we can't necessarily talk about those in a more formal sense. We can talk about them in a colloquial way, but we can't make decisions that may impact others economically, such as the agricultural department, recreational departments, or companies, and instead you're worried about public health. Towards that, though, we know that a lot of these new and emerging technologies, like remote sensing and machine learning, are incredibly valuable economically. A study that we conducted at Utah Lake showed that just for one single bloom event on Utah Lake, we saved about $370,000 in public health costs by warning the state and warning the public about the dangers of that single harmful algal bloom. And again, I can't stress, you saw the GIF I had earlier, the harmful algal bloom happens every single day from May until October in Utah Lake, sometimes persisting into the winter under the ice. So that just one event led to a lot of positive growth. But again, we're limited in the way that we're able to implement that. So shifting away kind of more specifically from water quality, at ESRI, I like to think of our framework of the data and goals that we're trying to reach. So this is one of my favorite diagrams to show, and it shows on the x-axis the data and services that we have, that you all have to make decisions and to do your science. And then on the y-axis, we have audience access. So it goes all the way from those of you doing fundamental science and research, all the way up to talking to the public and helping them understand. And in between, we have folks who are in charge of budgeting, and then decision makers making these really hard choices sometimes about science. So again, I go from to be able to use the data that you're collecting and then visualize it for decision making and then understanding it at the public level. And I'll go into that a little bit more detail. Joaquin touched on this, but one of the biggest challenges we face, especially in the geospatial realm, is that technology data and analysis are quickly outpacing accessibility, understanding, and education in that space. So the question becomes, how do we close the gap and then explicitly link what I call that data-driven goal to narrative-driven goals, and then we're able to open the door to broader audience access from decision makers, policymakers, and the public, and help them understand what they're working with. At its core, policy mapping reconnects data with the people that are involved, again, all the way from the scientists to the public. If you engage with all of those different spectrum of users, you're going to probably get 3 different reactions from a map. That's what we think of. 1, wow, that's awesome, great job, this really helps. 2, a little bit of skepticism, that's interesting, I'd like to learn more. 3, no, you're wrong, try again, take it back. But actually the 4th is the worst, which is apathy and disengagement. So that's what we try to avoid. Try to make maps that are actually engaging and help towards your goals. So I'd like to take you, for an example, through a journey of data to decisions through my flowchart. So we'll start with this concept of using the data. I'm not going to go into the different algorithms and science behind it, but I'll start with an example that NOAA in 2018 came out with a report on patterns and projections of high tide flooding along the US coastline. So again, they used their data, they used their tools, techniques to create this report and come out with an authoritative voice towards maybe what others should be using as well. But does the public understand that? Do our policymakers understand that? No, not necessarily. It's a very technical report and really dense. So we scale up to wanting to be able to visualize that data so that we're reaching budget makers and decision makers. Here's one version of how we can do that, a graph or a chart that a lot of us are used to publishing in manuscripts or showing off in our presentation. Here, the white bars are the median high tide flood days per year, and then we have a dotted line that shows sea level rise over time. Again, it's interesting. A lot of us who are technical understand this and understand what it's saying, but does the public understand, do our decision makers understand the implications of that? We can go from that to actually a map, visualizing what this means. So this is Norfolk, Virginia. The blue indicates where the danger of flooding, inundation occurs. And the green are, if you can see it, the green are areas where we have low elevation, might actually be even more in danger of flooding. So we have a single static map. We can go from that to a dynamic map, so allowing the public to see, where's the water body, giving an example of a satellite view, and scroll over in and out between where we might see inundation. So that's one step towards it. Another one is simple visual storytelling. We see this a lot in the newspaper. Pictures of flooding. People relate to that. They know this road. They know a road that they travel on that might be due to flooding. So that's really impactful, showing houses underwater. It hits at the empathetic nerves, and we start to get a sense of, oh, this is why this is important. We can go further. We can cast out projections. So here's 2040 sea level rise in red, highest risk, orange, meso, and then yellow, lower risk areas. So that's 25 years out, 15 years out. 40 years out, it gets worse. And then 60 years out, it's even worse. So that tells a story of what's going to happen over time due to projections. Again, towards that more personal touch, we can zoom in. This is an elementary school. You have children, you want to think, oh, I don't want my elementary school to be in danger of flooding. They can barely afford supplies as it is. How are they going to get funding to rebuild if it does flood? So again, we can do something like oriented imagery, where it shows a more dynamic view, get a sense of Norfolk, Virginia, and where you are in its location. But really, if we want to dive deeper down, we need to go even further into this journey into the data and decision making and make it really accessible, really personal in terms of connecting people and engaging people with the data. So at ESRI, we've created, hopefully this will automatically play, we've created a virtual reality. So that's my colleague, Keith Van Graafland, down on the left-hand corner. We have a virtual reality model that we can run where you put on the headset and you can actually explore Norfolk, Virginia. We have other cities as well in real time and see where the flooding occurs. So this gets you a sense of, oh, okay, I've been on the waterfront. I now understand kind of more personally where this flooding occurs and how it might affect me. And we can do things like highlight our vector data into this integration to show these buildings will be affected. Oh, I've been there, that's the farmer's market, and get a more personal touch. Similarly, towards policy recommendations, proposed seawall has been made in Norfolk, Virginia. So again, we can put those tidal simulations built from that very beginning by NOAA into action here, build this seawall, and the public or anyone who puts on this VR headset can get a real sense of, oh, I see with this proposed seawall, which might be controversial in some areas because it might drain flooding from important wetlands. It might flood other areas. It'll have implications no matter what. But if we put this in, we can start to see, I understand why decision makers, our policymakers, our government are budgeting money towards this giant seawall. Lastly, storytelling is really important to us at ESRI. So one of the things we employ a lot are story maps. And so that's condensing down all of this data, the pictures, the static maps, the charts, the bars, the virtual reality screenshots, or the ability to go into virtual reality into a singular place where the public can come and understand and engage with this type of information at their own leisure, and then feel more informed coming out of it. It's a really nice way to speak to more simplification of data from that very start. Here in California, we're working towards the concept of environmental justice and equity. So the geographic approach can highlight areas where others might have been neglecting potentially inequitable decision-making on the landscape. So here's a community water needs assessment tool in Tulare-Kern County, looking at who has wells and who might be at risk for contamination in those wells. Again, this highlights areas that may have been overlooked before if we didn't know to look for them. Towards harmful algal blooms, we're working with the Army Corps of Engineers to build a harmful algal bloom monitoring tool, a web app where decision makers like myself in my previous role at Utah and other states that have harmful algal bloom monitoring programs can surf on here and then be able to look at their water body over time and then disseminate this information, these screen grabs, to the public and decision makers so that they can say, hey, this is what we're seeing, this is why it's dangerous, and this is why you should stay out of the water. The policy life cycle and policy mapping goes all the way from advocacy map to policy evaluation and analysis, and I'll quickly run through these and the questions that we like to ask in a cartographic and geographic approach, and one that I'd like all of you to potentially think about, and I'd love to have discussions around where your science fits in and where we can plug in more of the science into each of these individual steps. So with advocacy maps, we're asking, where is the current problem? Where is there limited access, for example, no access at all? Is there something too close to something else? Those are the fundamental questions that these advocacy maps ask, and they raise awareness towards a problem. Policy comparison, what have other similar jurisdictions done in order to try to solve a particular problem? What would it take to replicate that success story in our neck of the woods? Did they achieve the desired outcome, and what challenges did they face? And then once we get there, what are our policy options? Which option will benefit the most people? Could we implement more than one option? Could an intervention in one area have effects or spill over into a nearby area? What will the costs be? And then who stands to gain and who stands to lose in each option? So that leads us to the last step, which is decision support maps. So where is the need the greatest? Where is access lacking? Where would be a good pilot for the program? Where do we have the best chance of being successful? And where are those places that are just below a certain goal or threshold that we could maybe implement something to try something out? After that, we come to our outcomes map. Are we seeing the results? Did we meet our goal? And how does the current status compare to pre-intervention? That leads us to accountability to make sure that our decision makers, our budgeting offices, and policymakers are accountable and that we're taking taxpayer money into account when we're making these decisions. Lastly, policy evaluations. Did we achieve what we set out to do? Asking some uncomfortable questions like, were there unintended consequences? Did it work for some places but not others? And should we pivot and have new recommendations going forward? So again, I bring it back to this, the framework of data and goals, and that's where I'd love to have discussions with all of you going forward. a lot of you are using the data, and my implorement is to ask that you think about, yes, you're using the data. How do we get that all the way up to understanding the data so that the public knows where we're coming from and policymakers feel empowered to implement what you're doing, and that your science is robust and as important as possible. So thanks for listening. I appreciate it.
Well,
good morning. I don't have slides. So first disclaimer, the days of talking off the top of my head without slides are long gone, so I do have some notes down here. Yesterday, I was teacher for the day. 5 classes on the science of drinking water. 6 hours without a break. So if we get through 10 minutes and my voice lasts out, we've done pretty good. So my name is Rochelle. I manage the water quality section at the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California. I'm not a policymaker. As the manager of the Water Quality Lab, I'm on the receiving end of policies and regulations. I do want to start by saying, so we heard in the introduction that water quality is declining, that there are challenges on our precious water resources, and that is true. But I do want to start by saying that water utilities are doing an excellent job in providing safe, reliable drinking water. I'm not going to stand here, and say that everything's just fine. All of our detection methods for chemicals and microbes are just great, and we don't need any improvements, because there's always room for improvement. But in general, water treatment plants do a remarkably good job of treating very large volumes of water every day of the year without fail and without break to make it safe for human consumption. But I'm not going to talk about treatment anymore. I'm here to talk about methods, hopefully without getting too much into the weeds. But I have spent my life in the lab. I live in the lab, which means I tend to live in the weeds. So bear with me if this does go way too much into the weeds of contaminant detection methods. New challenges come along all the time. New regulations are introduced to deal with those challenges, and the water industry adapts. In the 1980s, disinfection byproducts came to the fore as a concern. In the 1990s, cryptosporidium was the driver for change in the drinking water industry. Then various volatile organic compounds in the 2000s. There was a lot more awareness of cyanotoxins, and we've just heard about satellite mapping of harmful algal blooms. A lot more awareness about cyanotoxins started to grow in the 2010s. And now we have microplastics and PFAS making headlines. And I'm sure many people, because it's been all over the news, many people are aware that just Wednesday this week, the EPA announced final national primary drinking water regulations for 6 PFAS in drinking water. So as we get more regulated constituents, sometimes requiring alternative or additional treatments, and always more monitoring, always more monitoring, the scope of water testing requirements and the need for improved methods continues to increase. Through our member agencies, Metropolitan provides drinking water to about 19 million people across Southern California. We've got 5 treatment plants, and our treated water deliveries over the last 20 years have ranged from about 1,400 acre-feet, that's 456 million gallons, to over 3,000 acre-feet, or about 1 billion gallons of treated water per day. So just think of that for a moment. That's what our treatment plants, every day, 1 billion gallons of water. And that's why I say the plants generally are doing a remarkably good job of achieving that goal, achieving that mission. At our water quality lab that I manage, We test about 70,000 samples per year using 400 different methods, and we generate over 250,000 test results every year. We do all this, obviously, to make sure that our treated water meets all state and federal drinking water standards and is protective of public health. We monitor for coliforms and E. coli, the pathogens Cryptosporidium and Giardia, disinfection byproducts, metals, volatile and synthetic organic compounds, pesticides, and cyanotoxins. And the methods we use range from simple culture-based methods, chromogenic methods, fluorescence microscopy, all kinds of microscopy, immunosorbent assays, gas chromatography, liquid chromatography, mass spectrometers, ion chromatography. And for taste and odor compounds, these are naturally occurring compounds that make water taste and smell bad, we use a very simple but highly effective monitoring tool. Anyone want to guess? Thank you. The nose, human nose, one of the best tools we've got. We actually have a formal sniffing panel, meets twice a week. Introduction of the invasive quagga mussels into the Colorado River in 2007. It made operations more challenging, but we continued to treat and deliver water, but it gave us something else to monitor, quagga mussel babies by polarized microscopy. And with recent legislative and regulatory developments, we are now looking to bring online methods for microplastics and, of course, PFAS. So far I've just been talking about detecting and monitoring methods we use in the lab. But we also do a lot in the field. Temperature, pH, turbidity, chlorine residual, and nitrate are all required and relatively easy to do in the field in real time or close to real-time manner. The most time-consuming aspect of much of the monitoring for those parameters that we do in our distribution system is usually the drive time in LA traffic between all the different sampling points, and we have a lot of sampling points spread across Southern California. For monitoring our lakes, we use floating platforms, remote sensing platforms out on the lakes with all kinds of sensors hanging beneath them, and they collect continuously and transmit that data wirelessly back to the lab. Things like temperature, dissolved oxygen, conductivity, chlorophyll. As we've just seen, we also use satellite-based monitoring tools to keep track of the entire region's lakes, but primarily the lakes that we rely on. We're measuring light reflectance at certain wavelengths so that we can monitor the density of algae and cyanobacteria. Some of these cyanobacterial blooms, many of them are harmless. They just make the lake look green. Some of them produce the taste and odor compounds I just mentioned, methyl isoborneol and geosmin. Harmless, but make the water taste and smell bad, and creates a sense of lack of confidence in the safety of water if you turn your tap on it. It just smells whiffy. But some of them, a few of them, do produce cyanotoxins, and it does appear that we are seeing more frequent cyanotoxin-producing blooms. So obviously, keeping track of those blooms is important. There are a variety of commercial platforms, and ESRI and EPA and others have worked on these satellite-based tools. The tool we're currently using, we developed all the algorithms and data analysis and data capture for that in-house. And finally, by way of introduction, because this is just the introduction, for the last 5 years, we've been operating and testing our reuse demonstration plant to assess treatment performance and removal of contaminants. The data we are currently, and it's the water quality section that's doing this testing. The data that we generate will be used for engineering, design, and permitting of a 150 million gallons per day advanced recycled water treatment plant, if approved, to move forward to full scale. And at the core of this reuse testing is methods to measure pathogen and chemical removal. So Metropolitan's Water Quality Lab and staff have an understandably strong interest in improved methods for detecting, quantifying, and identifying a wide variety of contaminants in water, because that's what my staff do each and every day. They detect things in water. Former and current staff have helped to develop many of the methods that are now in routine use throughout the water industry, and we continue to pursue improvements. Now, I should note, when I talk about methods, that Metropolitan's Water Quality Lab is not typical for a water utility, either in this country or elsewhere. There are a few large utilities that have similar labs, But most water utilities do not have the kind of lab capabilities that we have at Metropolitan. So against this background, what new, improved detection methods are we looking for? It's simple: faster, cheaper, and more reliable. The end. Actually, it isn't that simple. It's not as easy as it sounds. We need faster methods and quicker turnaround time. When we have a shutdown or emergency repair in our distribution system, and it does happen, we need to ensure that the water meets standards before we can return that section of pipe to service. And one of the routine tools we use is coliform monitoring. They're indicators of potential contamination. Current coliform and E. coli monitoring methods need 18 to 24 hours to get a result. We could return our pipes and infrastructure to service a lot quicker and get the water flowing a lot quicker if we had faster methods that turned around results in a couple of hours rather than a day. We use coliforms and E. coli as indicators of potential contamination, but we also monitor for pathogens. The standard method for detecting Cryptosporidium and Giardia, protozoal pathogens, can take a few days. And detecting enteric viruses by cell culture is a weeks-long process. Now, there's a wide variety of molecular methods targeting DNA or RNA that have been developed as alternative, quicker approaches to detecting pathogens and other microbes. And some PCR methods are now called real-time PCR. The polymerase chain reaction, or PCR as I just mentioned, was invented in the late 1980s. I was there. And was being used to develop detection methods for drinking water within just a few years of that. We use it today for some specialized monitoring and identifying microbes, but after so many years of research and method development, it has still not been adopted for routine use in the water industry almost 40 years later. And there's a couple of reasons for this. The facilities and equipment to do PCR, while not particularly difficult, are a step or two above what most utilities would be familiar or comfortable with. Also, there's a question of what does a molecular positive result mean? Detecting nucleic acids in a sample indicates that the target pathogen was present at some time, but doesn't tell us anything about viability, infectivity, or the actual risk to human health. Just because we find DNA in a sample, it doesn't mean we have an acute contamination problem right now. A common problem across many methods and target analytes, whether they're microbial or chemical, is the challenge of concentrating the large volumes needed to achieve the required sensitivity, and then cleaning up that concentrate, sometimes with extraction, so that we can then inject it into our fancy machines, or put it under the microscope, or introduce it into a cell culture and grow it. We've got all kinds of sophisticated, sensitive, and in some cases, quick assays, but the challenge lies in getting samples into a suitable form that we can then apply those assays. Any detection method is only as good as the sample material we test. I used to use the phrase from the early days of computing, GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. The methods are great, so long as we provide them with good material. For our lake monitoring, we need better ground truthing of the satellite data. The satellite information tells us if we've got cyanobacteria and algae growing in our lakes. It doesn't tell us whether or not they're producing toxins. So we need to know how well our satellite-based data correlates with actual cyanobacterial and algal densities. And it would be great, and this is probably far-fetched at the moment, but it would be great if we can identify toxin-producing species from space, not just all species. For our floating remote sensing platforms, which save us a lot of time, we don't have to drive out to our lakes. We've got remote sensing on our lakes. But they've got all the sensors hanging down underneath them. Biggest problem with those is keeping them clean. They're surfaces. Surfaces hanging in water are going to attract organisms. They're going to get covered in weeds and mollusks and biofilms. And keeping those things clean is almost a full-time job. So some kind of self-cleaning sensors would be great, but I don't know how practical that is. Real-time online monitoring It's like a holy grail for continuous evaluation of water quality monitoring, and is likely to become more in demand and more important as we move into more recycled water projects. We have online monitoring now for basic parameters like temperature, turbidity, and chlorine. And there's been a move to reagentless online monitors that are easier to maintain. But will we ever see routine online monitoring for coliforms, E. coli, pathogens, metals, disinfection byproducts? The equipment used for some of these analytes now is big, complicated, and expensive, and it's hard to imagine it transitioning to an online configuration. Sticking with online monitoring, we're starting to see commercial platforms that combine online monitoring of some basic parameters like temperature, chlorine residual, turbidity, water flow, pressure in the pipe, combining all that with data analytics to continuously monitor distribution systems. And the idea is they will detect anomalies from normal, so anomalies that are predictors of possible problems in the distribution system. But we've not tested any of these systems yet in terms of their accuracy and reliability, but it's certainly a growing field, and there are more and more platforms becoming available. It'd be great if we could easily detect all possible contaminants in water, but we can't. Time, staff resources, and money. It's just not practical. So if we accept that detecting all potential contaminants is not feasible, whether operationally or economically, then we need to look to surrogates and indicators. But here we have the challenge of ensuring a good correlation between any indicators that we choose and the actual contaminant. Turbidity is an excellent indicator of water quality. Typically, clearer water means better water, better quality water. But turbidity does not always tell the whole story. Are there other easily measured parameters that can give a more complete picture of water quality? Now I'm going to give some general sort of closing comments. Regulating contaminants or making the decision whether or not to regulate can be a very long, drawn-out, laborious process. It can take years. It can take decades. Regulating agencies need info on the occurrence of a contaminant. How widespread is it? And they also need info on the health effects. How much of a problem? Is it an acute problem? Is it a chronic problem? And they then decide whether or not there will be a meaningful benefit to public health if that contaminant is regulated. Sometimes regulation can be speeded up through the legislative process, and we're essentially mandated to quickly start looking for contaminants. But it's very important whichever approach we take, whether it's through the longer, slower regulatory process or the legislative process, that we don't start looking for contaminants before we've got good, reliable methods. We have to be very careful not to put the horse before the cart. We have to have good methods first before we can then mandate that we have to monitor for those particular contaminants. As we talk about developing new methods and improving the sensitivity of methods, we do need to keep cost in mind. Faster, more sensitive, and more reliable will quite often mean more expensive. And the lab equipment that I mentioned early on, the lab equipment we use, can already be quite expensive. And speaking of cost, and this is something that is usually forgotten, we are becoming more and more reliant on sensitive and sophisticated and complicated equipment. And therefore, we have to have service contracts to maintain that equipment and repair it when it fails. And it does fail, lots of moving parts. 3 or 4 years worth of maintenance contracts usually adds up to the cost of a brand new piece of equipment. So there isn't just the initial capital outlay of buying this fancy equipment. There's the cost of maintaining it and maintaining it in working order. The water industry, regulators, and policymakers need to be able to communicate the significance of any monitoring results to the public. So we get a positive, but what does a positive mean to, this is empty, don't worry, to the glass of water that you may get in the morning. Yes, we detected compound X in the water, but what is the relative risk to health at the concentration we detected it at? Because methods are getting more and more sensitive, and if we look, we will find things in drinking water. But does that mean it poses a risk to human health? Water quality monitoring without proper context can be confusing and only tells part of the story. Now I'm done, but I'm going to finish with one more thing. Who's a fan of Star Trek? Not a single, yeah, go, we've got some fans of Star Trek. So what would Mr. Spock do? I've just gone and got my glass of water. Mr. Spock would come over, and he'd get his tricorder. I can't do Mr. Spock's accent. Yeah, that water has got no contaminants in it. It meets all public health requirements. Sorry, you can't see what I'm doing. That water is safe to drink. I did that 25 years ago at a similar conference on the water industry needs for drinking water methods. I didn't use a cell phone back then. I used a pocket calculator, but I did the same thing. And I even talked about Mr. Spock. And two guys in the audience stood up and they said, "We can do that for you now." I'm still waiting.
So we have time for a few quick questions. Sure, what we'd like to do is make sure that everyone can hear.
I'd be happy to. Jerry Secundi, actually a former colleague of Joaquin, and this is for Joaquin, this question. One of our major untapped resources has been direct potable use of recycled water. Orange County's been producing PO for decades. San Diego has been producing it, but they have to pipe it into a reservoir and mix it with the reservoir because magically it's going to get cleaner when it's in the reservoir. We've had a lot of public pushback because it's been toilet to the tap, potty to the pot. So my question to you, Joaquin, is what do you think the future is of direct potable use?
Thank you for the question. And you forgot sink to sip. I think I liked that one. That was pretty innovative amongst the headlines. I think it's bright. It is going to be an incredible tool, a needed tool. To your point right now, before we adopted, so taking a step back, the State Water Resources Control Board in December adopted direct potable reuse regulations. Prior to that, recycled water was able to be used for drinking water, but as to your point, it had to be augmented either with groundwater, which was our first regulations, which now Orange County is recycling, I think 100% of its wastewater. It's going straight into its aquifer that's contaminated with PFAS, and then being brought up and treated again. And so we allowed reservoirs to do that as well. Direct potable reuse is going to be an important tool, but it is going against 2,000 plus years of good housekeeping. Your waste streams and your drinking water streams shouldn't be crossing, but we are in a direct way. And what we thankfully have is a lot of science, a lot of monitoring, to Paul's good points, and a lot of trust to be able to say, yes, it is pure water. Yes, it is not really making sense to have to put it into a reservoir or groundwater for a system to then just treat again. It's an added cost. So we're hopeful that it'll provide cost savings. Importantly, because of all the redundancy, the tools, the technology that's going to be needed, it's not going to necessarily be small systems that you see doing direct potable reuse. And with my health hat on and as a regulator, want to be careful that we don't erode the public trust in the tool by having a bad moment. And so I think first what we'll see, and Metropolitan is a huge leader in this and has been thankfully, met the large agencies. They've been testing. We were developing these direct potable reuse regulations with them because these weren't as fleshed out as, I know Colorado and Texas have some projects, but we had never undertaken this deep of an undertaking to really say, can it be protective of public health and what do we need to do? I mean, the log removal for viruses on it is like 9.18 nines or something after that. So it is, we're trying to bring the public along because to your point, there is a bit of an ick factor, but we can tell it's pure, we know it's pure, and we have regulations that will be placed to help. So I think it's bright. Right now, we recycle about 800,000 acre-feet of water yearly within the state. And that potential we know is, it's up into the amount of effluent we have, which is about 2.5 million acre-feet a year, but is a lot to grow into, especially because it's drought-proof, and especially because it's removing nutrients that are otherwise being dumped into the ocean at this point. Whether it's the Southern California Bight or San Francisco Bay, it's contributing to eutrophication, hypoxia, and ultimately cyanobacteria, harmful algal blooms. So, but there's issues with concentrating that brine, and I think that's where it's going to be great to see how this continues to evolve on implementation. But I think it's bright and it's a really needed tool. Appreciate the question.
Great, thanks. Oh, Bruce.
Can you hear me? Yeah. I want to go back to this business of the microplastics and the PFAS. Every day there are new products that are introduced upstream. Is there anything in an ideal world that would improve the detection early so that we don't have to wait until you find it in the streams? Is there any, in an ideal world, could there be something done with each new product such that you would know in advance that these things are coming out? It just seems to me right now we're in a sort of react mode, and I think Paul and all you guys really suggested this is an ongoing problem. So is it, some of us are political scientists, we're kind of interested, what would be a way to sort of strengthen, because you've got a very fractured world with states and local governments and state governments all involved in this. Is there a way we could strengthen the upstream detection of these problems?
If any of you want to take it first, I have strong feelings and I don't want to just jump in. So
I have strong feelings too, and I'm not sure I'm going to publicize
I have
them.
medium feelings, so I can.
Let's hear all of them. Let's hear all the strong feelings.
For me, to me that sounds like a one implementation of a map, right? So we do a lot of hotspot mapping for aggregating down a lot of information that's coming in and looking at risk assessment. So for me and my colleagues here can challenge this, but for me, it's looking at these new products that are being introduced. If a new plant is being introduced, an airport spill. So one of the biggest sources is getting into waterways is when they have to put out a fire at the airport. Those are emergencies. So lighting up those hotspots or identifying areas where PFAS might be a contaminant, and then being able to allocate resources like testing, and then regulatory decisions based on that is where, in my opinion, the geospatial data and maps come into play. But that's my perspective.
Whenever we talk about water quality, we always trace it all the way back to source water protection. If we can protect our source waters, it makes it a lot easier for the treatment plants to do what they need to do, and I don't need to spend so much time looking for things because they're not there in the first place because we protected our source waters. And so it's a societal issue. We're all using products. We all go and buy stuff when it's made, the latest, whatever the newfangled piece of equipment is, or packaging, or product, consumer product. And so we need to look at the waste streams from the production of everything we all buy every day. How we do that, I don't know. Considering the number of new products that have been developed, businesses make money by developing new innovative products. We have to be looking at life cycle, not just life cycle costs, but life cycle impacts of those products. And if we identify that the waste stream from all these products is potentially harmful, then somehow we have to divert it. We have to make the companies that are producing them responsible for those waste streams so they don't hit our source waters. So in an ideal world, yeah, it would be great if those waste streams were non-existent. How we get there, I don't know.
completely agree with my two great colleagues up here. It is partly characterizing and getting better at that so that we can get at an issue, but it is also going upstream of the problem. And regrettably, it's ratepayers, it's communities that bear the brunt of we're candid, a bit of a broken chemicals regulatory industry where there isn't a precautionary principle applied. It is upon all of us to end up finding the evidence for environmental or public health harm to then begin to remove it. And PFAS is, number one right now of an example of that. How you improve that without harming the great economic needs that I'm sure are out there as well is really important that we figure out. Unfortunately, when it comes to my decision-making space and where we are, we're downstream of all that. We are at the tap, we are in communities, and that's what bears the brunt of what is otherwise, capital that is made off of products that don't have to first show their safety. It is, then later left up to all of us to prove it and then at great cost remove it. So it is something that we need to continue to be focused on, because that's what helps with affordability. That's what helps with these challenges is really going upstream and not letting them enter the watersheds or communities to begin with. But we haven't figured that one out yet. But the precautionary principle is an important one, I think, ultimately, when we think of how for the long term and for multiple generations we protect what we have.
So thank you for the discussion. I'm Mamadou Diallo. I'm an NSF program director. I would love to see a proposal for an investigator say we can selectively tune remote sensing to detect fluorine, total fluorine, and then I push it further. If somebody comes to me and say, my total fluorine detection, I can tune it to determine inorganic or organic fluorine. It'll be really have a major impact. I mean, whether you can do it remote sensing, that's a different story. But if you look at the waste itself, I mean, advanced X-ray, spectroscopy, all those things can help you tune out things, right? But my question is not going to be about PFAS. My question is actually, you mentioned disinfection byproduct. So here is what I have seen as an NSF program director. We have a large portfolio of disinfection byproduct, all kind of new products. But I don't know what information, how they're going to give that information to you to make some decision about these hundreds of disinfection products. Are you going to remove them? Or, I mean, how do you make sense of this soup of disinfection byproduct?
Well, it's mostly the job of the regulators to make sense of all this data, and they look at toxicity information when any new constituent is identified, potentially harmful constituent like new disinfection byproducts. Whenever that are identified, we go through a period of monitoring to see how widespread. We develop the methods first, then go through a period of monitoring to see how widespread they are. There has to be toxicity information to determine what the true, either acute or chronic health risk is. And then the regulators make a decision as to whether or not those compounds are going to be regulated in drinking water at a certain level.
Yeah, and I think if I can add, the challenge with disinfection byproducts is similar to PFAS insofar as it can feel like we're on a treadmill, a never-ending treadmill, and we know that's the case for PFAS as we pursue, PFOS and PFOA, and know that there are a number of other variants out there. And I know your question wasn't on PFAS, but I will note that we are at the State Water Board really trying to think, okay, how maybe do we look at total, fluorine and figure out standards that don't leave us chasing, the many, many different variants of PFAS that we could end up doing. And I think similar with disinfection byproducts a bit, it's trying to get at, and when you look at the disinfection byproducts, I think it's sometimes largely a matter of how you're running your system. And that's very unique to each water system. That's very unique to the capacity of that water system to not do things like over-chlorinate or have constituents that are reacting with chlorine in a way that is creating those challenges. So, it is a challenge of ours. It is going to be a balance that continues to be how do we don't kind of go down the many different variants we know that are there, but continue to find either treatment techniques or things that we can tell operators to do that will here help disinfection byproducts or help how we see the total impact of PFAS chemicals and not like a chemical by chemical maximum contaminant limit that becomes very hard to implement ultimately.
And just to quickly jump on sort of the back of that, Joaquin mentioned, it's partly how treatment plants are operated, how you're running your system. It's not practical for everyone, but there's different types of disinfectants. Yeah, a lot of the disinfection byproducts are generated by chlorine reacting with organic matter. And that was one of the main drivers for the original disinfection byproduct regulations in the late 1970s and 1980s. And it was what drove Metropolitan to convert all of its treatment plants to ozone. We don't use chlorine as a primary disinfectant, we use ozone, and that produces far less disinfection byproducts than chlorine.
Well, it's time to transition to panel 2. I need to turn over the microphone torch to Laura. So as we transition, panelists come on down. Please help me thank our panel from this morning.